First of all, I want to say that I just an hour ago I just heard Benny Gantz, the head of the Kol Lavan party, who was who was voted in to be the Speaker of the Knesset for at least a moment. And the reason I'm quoting this is not because of the politics, but because he started talking about the coronavirus, and he said something which quite a few people have been talking about. That, in other words, when you have a crisis situation, we actually should look at it as an opportunity. And one of the things which I find fascinating is that as a result of Corona, there are so many different classes and learning opportunities which are now being offered online, which didn't exist before. And then all of a sudden, it seems like a whole world is being opened up. And what I find maybe even just as remarkable is that people are actually taking advantage of those opportunities. So the first thing I want to say is kol hakavod to all of you people who are now tuning in to hear this shiur on Parshat Shavua. I must say that this is a larger crowd than I usually get when I teach at Pardes, so that it is really an unbelievable opportunity to be able to teach. And although in Pardes, when I ask questions, very often I'll say this is not a rhetorical question, tonight it might end up being that it actually will be questions that are more rhetorical because of the fact that we do have certain limitations on the ability of people to participate. So without any further ado, so let's get to the Parsha. And I want to begin with an anecdote. I've been teaching at Pardes for 42 years. I think it was about, and as I'm getting older, I lose track a little bit of time. I think somewhere between 30 and 35 years ago, Nechama Leibowitz, the famous Bible scholar, gave a class at Pardes to the teachers, to the faculty. And at the end of the class, I don't even remember why, but I got into a conversation with her. And I started saying to her that I was actually teaching that year Vayikra. And then she looked at me and she said, "Oh, Parshat Kedoshim." And then I said to her, "No, I'm teaching the beginning that has to do with all the sacrifices." And then her response was, "Be'emet? Really?" Now, I imagine that everyone here has a real problem with Vayikra. And I must admit myself that for many years, I actually thought that not this week's Parsha, but next week's Parsha, Parshat Tzav, is probably the most boring Parsha in the whole Torah. And the reason why people have such difficulty with Vayikra is that we have a lot of technical details about sacrifices, ritual purity and impurity. Not only do we have technical details, but the information which is being given seems to be totally irrelevant to our lives. So I hope that after the class today, you'll feel that somehow not only this Parsha, but the book of Vayikra does have, in fact, relevance to your life. So let me begin with Nachmanides, Ramban's introduction to the book of Vayikra. In his introduction to Vayikra, Nachmanides says, and by the way, he has an introduction to every book of the Chumash. He says that Vayikra, we start explaining all the laws of the sacrifices, of the protection, you might say, of the sanctity of the tabernacle. And then he goes on to say, and there are a whole bunch of other laws also, but essentially Vayikra is what is known in rabbinic literature as Torat Kohanim, the book of the priests. It's the book which, in effect, is giving us the laws that are very much relevant to the priesthood. Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, who was an Orthodox rabbi in Germany in the late 1800s, early 1900s, who at one point became the head of the rabbinical seminary there, has a different take a little bit on the book of Vayikra. And he says that, yes, Vayikra is Torat Kohanim, but he says Vayikra is Torat Kohanim in the sense of what God says to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, when the Jews come to Mount Sinai, God says to them, Va'atem tihiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. You will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy people. And it's his explanation which I would like to pursue during the course of this shiur. And in fact, what I would like to say is that the book of Vayikra is essentially outlining how do we build a model society? How do we build a society which will be a light unto the nations? How do we build a society which ultimately will bring and sustain the divine presence in our midst? And perhaps before I start talking about our parsha, I would like to look back at the last few parshiot that we've had in the book of Shmot and to understand what actually is happening. I would even use the language, what is the revolution that's now come about? Since this is the season, today was Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and in another 2 weeks, we will be having the Seder, and we'll be talking about the exodus of the Jewish people, the movement from slavery to freedom. The freedom of the Jewish people is actualized when they receive the Torah at Mount Sinai, when they enter into a covenantal relationship with God. And what I would like to begin with is when the Jewish people enter into that covenantal relationship with God, we are now ushering in a new reality, a new creation, a new world. In many of my classes in the past, I've spoken about how in the whole thrust of the 10 plagues is to unravel Egyptian society, to bring Egyptian society back to some sort of primordial state. And in the midst of that chaos, all of a sudden we have a new creation, the Jewish people. It's like a restart. And of course, as we look at the Parshiot at the end of Shmot, we have a downfall similar to what we had in the Garden of Eden when the Jewish people built the golden calf. But the end of the book of Shmot is the construction of the tabernacle. The tabernacle is the crowning achievement where the whole people are involved to do what? To build a sanctuary, to create a space, to enable God's presence to come back and dwell in the world. And therefore, at the end of the book of Shemot, the last verses, chapter 40, verse 34, 35, we're told that the glory of God fills the tabernacle. The same glory of God which was resting on Mount Sinai. But building the tabernacle is just creating a structure. At Pardes right now, well, not right now because people are preoccupied with the coronavirus, but right now there's something which is very exciting, that Pardes is on the threshold of beginning to build its new building. And with God willing, once the virus is over, we can start, and then hopefully it won't take so long. And the plans show the building will be beautiful. But ultimately, the question is not the building, but the content of the building. What is happening in the building? And here is where the book of Vayikra comes in. After the Jewish people put such tremendous effort, show such great enthusiasm in building the Mishkan, and literally bring down the presence of God in this building, the next step is, how do we service that building? What's the content which we give that building? And in effect, those are the laws of the sacrifices. But as I mentioned earlier, the laws of sacrifices and the laws of ritual purity and impurity, and the various laws which we have safeguarding the sanctity of the tabernacle, are only half of the book. Chapter 1 through chapter 17 essentially are dealing with sacrifices, ritual purity and impurity. But then all of a sudden in chapter 18 in the book of Vayikra, we go into prohibited sexual relationships. Chapter 19, Parshat Kedoshim. We have a whole parsha dedicated to interpersonal relations. Eventually go on to talking about the laws of the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year, Shabbat and festivals. So that the book of Vayikra is not only about the service in the temple. The book of Vayikra is, how do we take that service in the temple and then reflect it in our day-to-day lives? And now I want to, in a certain sense, use the language of Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, who I mentioned earlier, who says that the first part of the book, which deals with the tabernacle, with the temple, with the sacrifices, is preoccupied with the question, the larger question, of how do I create an I-thou encounter? How do I create, in his language, dveikut, clinging to God? The second part of the book of Vayikra is, how do I sanctify life? How do I sanctify my day-to-day existence? How do I take my connection with God and then translate that in the most day-to-day behavior in my interpersonal relations? And what he argues, and I would agree with, is that these are not two separate books, but these are actually one book that need to be integrated. And in fact, if you actually go through what I just said, you'll see that the division which I mentioned to you is not so smooth. Because in fact, in chapter 11 of the book of Vayikra, we have the fundamental laws of kashrut in the midst of the section that speaks about the tabernacle and the priests. And in chapter 21, which is towards the end of the book, we have the regulations regarding who the priests can or cannot marry. And I think that the Torah did this consciously in order to show that the realm of the temple and the realm of our day-to-day lives are very much interwoven, and that each one should be informing the other. I would like to say right now, parenthetically, and for the many alumni who are online who know me. So I have somewhat of a reputation at Pardes of not being exactly a vegetarian and enjoying to eat meat. And yet I will be very honest and say that I myself find it very, very hard to visualize a temple where we're slaughtering animals, where blood is flowing all over, and to call this a religious experience. And very often, in order for me to be able to relate to Vayikra, I have to relate to it in a more abstract level, which is what I would like to do in another moment, to be able to understand, to get beyond, okay, the blood and guts, and to be able to also see what are the underlying ideas behind what we're doing. So let me begin, and I hope that everybody has a chumash, okay? And if you don't have an actual book, to be able to get it in Sefaria, I'd like to actually give, first of all, an outline of our Parsha. We have 5 chapters in our Parsha. And let's just go through it in a very broad way. All 5 chapters have to do with sacrifices. And all 5 chapters have to do with sacrifices from the perspective of the one who's bringing them. In chapter 1, the sacrifice which we're looking at is a korban olah. Literally, an offering which goes up to God. A sacrifice which is completely burnt on the altar. And if you follow me, we have 3 types of korban olah from verse 3. From verse 3 through verse 9, we have a sacrifice which is brought from cattle, bakar. Afterwards, from verse 10 through verse 13, we talk about a sacrifice that's brought from sheep, from goats. And then afterwards, from verse 14 till the end of the chapter, we talk about bird sacrifices, turtle doves, pigeons. So essentially, The three categories simply have to do with three types of animals which we can actually bring as a sacrifice. We bring from cattle, we bring from sheep, and we can bring bird offerings. And all of these are a korban olah, a burnt offering. Now, I would also like to, at this point, highlight that all of the sacrifices which are mentioned in chapter 1 are brought by individuals. All of them are being brought as free will offerings. They're not obligatory. And each person brings whatever they feel appropriate that they would like to now dedicate to God. Let's look for the moment very globally at chapter 2. In chapter 2, here the chapter division is actually very, very helpful. In chapter 2, we talk about meal offerings brought from fine flour and oil. And we have a whole variety of meal offerings. Sometimes we just have flour and oil. If you look, for example, in verse 4, so we have an offering that's called ma'afei tanur. It's not just that I take flour and oil, but that I then bake it in the oven. If I look at verse, if I look at verse 5, we're talking about machavat, the same ingredients, but I then fry them. In the next verse, 7, we're talking about marcheshet, which is deep fry. All of these are meal offerings, not animals, from flour. And what differentiates them are simply the different ways in which I make it. I fry it, I bake it, I just have it plain. All of these meal offerings are voluntary. But then we get at the end of chapter 2, in verse 14, it speaks about minchat bikurim, a first fruit meal offering. And the rabbis understand this to be referring to what we know as the Omer, an offering which is brought on the second day of Pesach from the first produce which is harvested, from the first produce which in fact is a barley offering. But this offering is different than all the ones that we've mentioned up to this point, because it's not individual, it's not voluntary. Which then raises a bit of a question, so why are we sticking it in over here? I'll come back to that. Now let's go on to chapter 3. In chapter 3, we discuss peace offerings, korban shlamim. And as I want to say to people, right, tongue in cheek, if you want to have peace, everybody has to get a piece. What's a peace offering? Where part of it is offered on the altar, part of it is given to the priests, the bulk of it is actually eaten. But a peace offering that's eaten cannot be eaten by one person. You could be talking about a cow, you could be talking about a sheep, even a goat. As I mentioned earlier, even as somebody who really enjoys meat, how much meat can I eat in 2 days? So clearly, if you want to consume this animal, you have to invite your friends in. And that seems to be a major idea behind a peace offering. Its intent is to bring together a community. I'll come back to this point a little bit later. And once again, by the peace offering, just by the Korban Olah, the different types of offerings are functions of the different types of animals that I bring. I realize I'm speaking now in very, very general terms because we don't have the luxury of going into detail in all these things, but you'll see in a minute why I'm doing this. Let's go on to chapter 4. In chapter 4, all of a sudden we encounter a new type of offering, a sin offering. The sin offering is not voluntary. It's obligatory. And in fact, if you go through chapter 4, you see that it's also very interesting in terms of the different offerings that are described. We start off with the sin offering in chapter 4 of the high priest, the anointed priest who commits a sin. And then we go on in chapter 4, verse 13, to talking about a sin that was committed by the Jewish community. And the rabbinic understanding being the Jewish community who did something wrong based on a legal decision by the high court. And then after that, in verse 22, we talk about a sin offering of the prince, which the rabbis understand to mean the king. And then eventually we talk about, in sentence 27, of a sin offering of just a regular Jew. So that the different types of sin offerings described in this chapter may be referring to the same type of sin. And the rabbis understand it, a sin which is done unintentionally, that were it to be done intentionally, you would be liable karet, which means being cut off for the Jewish people, from the Jewish people. When you do it unintentionally, you bring a sin offering. Why are there these different sin offerings? Because it depends who's doing it. We have a different offering for the high priest, for the Jewish people who act upon a mistaken legal decision, for the king, and for just a regular Jew. And then we get to the last chapter. The last chapter is talking about other types of sin offerings, and eventually it talks about guilt offerings. Chapter 5 is also talking about offerings that are obligatory, and I would like to add that a guilt offering, and the word guilt, asham, which appears in chapter 5, is a higher level of accountability than just a sin offering, a chatat. The word chatat, chet, means a mistake, missing the mark. Guilt is much more loaded. And so now what I would like to do is step back for a moment and to then take what I just did very briefly. If I look at the structure of this parsha, we start off by talking about free will offerings, and we end up by talking about obligatory offerings. We end up talking about obligatory offerings which are connected with sin. It's very interesting that Nachmanides, in his introduction, which I mentioned to you earlier, when he speaks about what is the nature of this book, and he talks about, well, it contains the laws of the sacrifices and of all the things that we have to do to maintain the sanctity of the tabernacle in terms of ritual purity. He then goes on to say, this is Nachmanides, and all of this is to guarantee that the divine presence should not depart from Israel. And I want to just focus on that comment for a moment. Nachmanides is looking at what I showed you at the very beginning, which is that at the end of the book of Shemot, after the Jewish people put together the tabernacle, the crowning point is that the glory of God fills the tabernacle. Here we are. We have created this unbelievable I-thou encounter. And in the words of Nachmanides, or I'm paraphrasing them, don't mess it up. Right? Now that you brought the divine presence into the tabernacle, don't do anything that's going to ruin it. And therefore, here are these sacrifices which are going to make sure that we don't mess up. Now, that way of looking at the book is actually putting an emphasis, and Nachmanides himself does this, on the sin offerings. But I want you to realize that the Parsha, when it starts listing all the offerings, it doesn't start with the sin offerings. It actually starts with the free will offerings. And so now let me begin by looking at what I see is some of the ideas underlying these sacrifices related to what I mentioned to you earlier about how do I build a model society. When we talk about a korban olah is one which is totally burnt on the altar. And if we would like to understand what's the meaning behind the sacrifice, in fact, why do we begin with this sacrifice? I think probably the best place to start is to look at the precedent for the korban olah. Normally, I would ask you, okay, what is the precedent? And if there are people who are quick on the chat, you can write it in. Okay, what is the precedent of a korban olah? Where do we find in the book of Breshit a korban olah? I'll wait a minute if anybody wants to write it in on chat. Somebody wrote down, Myra wrote down Abel. So actually Abel, or Cain and Abel, is the first time we have the idea of a sacrifice, but in fact, it's a korban mincha. If you go back to chapter 4 in Breshit, you'll see they offer a mincha. I see here, Noach after the flood. Noach after the flood, yes, Noach does bring a korban olah. I'll come back to that. But I see Yonatan Rahmani. Yonatan, it's wonderful that you're with me. Yonatan Rahmani says Abraham. Abraham at the sacrifice, Akedat Yitzchak. God asks Abraham to bring Isaac as an olah. In the end, we know that Abraham did not bring Isaac. And instead, Abraham brings the ram in place of Isaac. But when Abraham brings the ram, to a great extent, he sets the precedent for sacrifices. And what do I mean by that? When God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, what was God really asking of Abraham? essentially God was asking Abraham, show me that you're prepared to give me everything. Nothing left behind. Total commitment. That is the meaning of a korban olah. For those people who mentioned, and rightfully so, that the first time we encounter a korban olah is Noah. When he exits the ark, the first thing which Noah does is to bring sacrifices, olot. And the meaning behind that statement is, I am about to create a new world where the basis of that world is total commitment to God. And our parsha begins with korban olah. What does that say? So before I get to what that says, let me get to what it doesn't say. When Moses first comes to Pharaoh in chapter 5 of Exodus, and you can check it out now, those people who want to scroll. And Moshe's initial encounter, he begins with something which he shouldn't have said, but that's not my topic now. He gives Pharaoh a kind of ultimatum. Thus says the Lord, let my people go. And Pharaoh responds by saying, I don't know the Lord. So then Moses has a fallback, which is what he actually should have said in the beginning, although he changes it slightly from what God said at the burning bush. He says to Pharaoh, the God of the Hebrews appeared to us. Or maybe a better translation would be, he popped in, he chanced to be. Let us go out into the desert and serve him. Why? Pen yifka'enu ba'dever ovecharev. Lest he injure us, he hurt us with a pestilence or with sword. Why does Moshe use that language? And what seems to be is that Moshe is essentially reflecting or speaking to Pharaoh a language which Pharaoh would understand. And it has to do with the nature of the relationship between God and people. Who are these gods? These gods are whimsical. These gods pop in. These gods are vengeful. If when these gods are on a whim, you don't give them what they want, they'll kill you. So what do? When the gods pop in, you have to essentially bribe them, bring them an offering. What's the purpose of the offering? To ward off these evil spirits. I might add on another level, an alternative would be that I might also bring them some gift. But why do I bring it? Because ultimately I want to get something from them. Which means your whole relationship with the gods is predicated on yourself, on your well-being, on either warding off any type of destructive force or being able to somehow get something. From a Jewish perspective, my relationship with God is first of all not predicated on fear. It's not based on the fact that I'm afraid, here is this God who's going to kill me, so let me give him something to get him off my back. My relationship with God is actually coming from a place of love, which is also why we begin with free will offerings. I'm not doing this because I have to do it. I'm not doing this because I'm afraid of anything. I'm doing it because I want to embrace this God. And if I even take the literal meaning of a korban olah, I want to go up. I want to transcend myself. I'm aspiring for something higher. I mentioned earlier that Akedat Yitzchak is in a way the precedent for the korban olah. When Abraham is now prepared to go through with the Akedah, there is nothing which he stands to gain by doing it. And the only reason to do it is because on a certain level, this is his love of God. The word korban, which we translate as sacrifice, in Hebrew, the root is karov, to bring near. It's the idea that I want to, by bringing this animal, come closer to God. What I'm trying to bring up is that sacrifices and the way it's structured in our parsha are maybe reflecting a fundamental concept here of our relationship with God. Our relationship with God should be grounded in love, in giving, in wanting to embrace. It should not be based on fear of punishment. I don't do it because I have to do it. I do it because I want to do it. That is the korban olah, the sense of total dedication to God. On another level, everyone is familiar with the Shema. After we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the next thing is V'yahavta et Hashem Elokecha. You should love the Lord your God. After I express my pledge of allegiance, right? I believe in this God. I am committed to this God. I then articulate, Moshe articulates, if you're committed, love God. Do it out of love, not out of fear. It's only in the second paragraph of the Shema that all of a sudden we have a concept of reward and punishment. So that's the first point, which is that by beginning to talk about korban olah, by beginning to talk about a voluntary offering, we're expressing how our relationship with God should be one of love, of giving. I want to jump for a second. The korban shlamim in chapter 3, which is kind of parallel, is also something which I do voluntarily. It's a voluntary offering whose main thrust is to create a sense of community, a community in service of God. If the olah is focused on the I-thou relationship, the korban shlamim is bringing an offering which implicitly is going to force me to be in community, to build a community, to realize how important community is in my life. It's not just about me and God, but how do we bring together a community that is in service of God. And I'll say parenthetically that the subcategory of Korban Shlamim that we see as perhaps the most significant is the Korban Pesach. And that is when the Jewish people, before they leave Egypt, bring the Korban Pesach. The whole point of this sacrifice is to be eaten by those people who signed up. And through that act of eating, in service of God, we come together not only as a community, but as a people. Which is why the Korban Pesach becomes the most significant expression of Jewish peoplehood. So here I have two sacrifices, which are reflecting my relationship to God, my relationship to community, which are both being done voluntarily. Now let me go back to the Korban Mincha. The Korban Mincha is actually the first offering which was brought in the Chumash. It was brought by Cain. And Abel jumped on the bandwagon. He brought fruits to God. The Korban Mincha is a gift, but not just any kind of gift. Hirsch in his commentary says the Korban Mincha is a way of acknowledging whatever I have belongs to God, and not seeing it as being me. Think about this actually. When is this offering brought? After Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. When is it brought? After God says to Adam, by the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. And if we think about this for a moment, it would be very easy for Adam, who essentially is working the ground, or in this case, Abel, or Cain, I should say, to say that here I am, I till the land, I produced whatever I produced. It's mine. I created it. And yet, what was Cain's response? No, let me dedicate this to God. And by dedicating it to God, I'm acknowledging it really belongs to God. Because ultimately, I need God to be able to produce. So again, if you think about it, if Korban Olah, which is how we begin, expresses my total dedication to God, Korban Mincha is a way of acknowledging that whatever I have is not really mine. It's a gift from God. A profound sense of gratitude. And then we go to Korban Shlamim, which is the idea of the need to build a community. So that the first two have to do with our relationship with God. The other one also is our relationship with God, but not individually, but as a community. It's only in chapter 4 and chapter 5 that we start talking about sin offerings and guilt offerings, which have to do with a breakdown. But even there, how do I look at a sin offering? Why am I bringing it? And it's very interesting in terms of how commentaries understand this. A sin offering is actually being brought also from a place of love, in the sense that God is giving me an opportunity to make up. We're not talking about a vindictive God who wants to punish me. We're talking about a God who actually wants to give me a second chance. Of a God who holds me accountable for what I've done, but at the same time wants to give me a break. And that becomes very interesting in terms of, to what extent does a person, when they bring a sin offering, acknowledge that there's something wrong which they have done, and then appreciate how much God is willing to give them an opportunity to make up, to make amends. What I've been trying to show you is how, by simply looking at the structure of our parsha and the flow of it, beyond the technical details, what does this say on a very profound level about our relationship with God and our relationship with community? And I'd like to end with 2 points. The first point, I mentioned earlier that in the section which speaks about meal offerings, this is chapter 2, verse 14. All of a sudden, we speak about a meal offering, which is communal, which is obligatory, but it's being put into the section of voluntary offerings. And what's even more striking is, if you look at how the verse begins, it says, Im takriv minchat bikurim, if you bring this offering. Well, what do you mean, if you bring this offering? It's not voluntary. And in fact, if you have Rashi's commentary, Rashi on this verse says that over here the word im does not mean if, but it really means ki, when. Well, that's a very nice way of putting it, because obviously he's bothered by the fact that this is not something which is optional. It's something which is obligatory. So why didn't the Torah just write the word ki, which would very clearly say that this is obligatory? And I think the explanation is very simple. Because the Torah wants to say, even when you're bringing something which is obligatory, treat it as if it's something which is voluntary. Which means, don't bring this thing because you have to do it. And very often when you have to do something, right, the expression on your face is, ugh, oh, why do I do this? Bring it because you want to bring it. Bring it with enthusiasm, with joy. I'm going to digress for 1 second. We all know that structured prayer, as we do it, is in place of the sacrifices. How many of us go to pray with joy, with enthusiasm? Or how many of us say, oh, 1 o'clock, mincha. Okay, come on, let's go. Let's get it over with. At what point does our service of God, which is obligatory, become a burden? Or at what point is it something which we do with enthusiasm? That's the message which is being brought across in how the sacrifices are being presented. Service of God should be coming from a place of love, enthusiasm, excitement, not because we have to do it. The last thing which I want to point out, and I will end with this, is that it's very, very interesting, the division that we have between the written law and the oral law. What we have in the Parsha, which again, I say is very problematic for many people, is the written law. The written law, which tends to give me a lot of details, which tends to be very technical, which is very dry, which is boring. But when we start reading the oral law, the midrashim, all of a sudden we see the kavanah, the inner meaning behind things. What ultimately is the point of doing this? And I want to end with this comment. There is a commentary, a modern commentary, on the book of Leviticus by Jacob Milgram. Jacob Milgram was a conservative rabbi from Berkeley, who was also a professor, who was a scholar, and he felt a need. He devoted his life to writing a commentary on Leviticus. He wrote a major commentary, which is very scholarly, and then what I call a kind of Reader's Digest version. And in the introduction to his commentary, he's an academic. He says, the book of Vayikra is all about values. And therefore, people should try to understand what are the underlying values behind the sacrifices, behind the laws of ritual purity and impurity, because that's what it's really about. And so now I want to share with you 3 verses that are all giving me a value, the same value, which I think is an important message. If we look at the very first verse, chapter 1, verse 2, when we begin the laws of sacrifices, it says, Daber o bnei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people and say to them, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban, if a man among you bring a sacrifice. The problem in the text is, why say the word Adam? It's superfluous. You could have just as easily said, if one brings ki yakriv mikem korban, left out that word. The Midrash, and Rashi quotes this, says, just Adam is referring to Adam, the first man. But what it's really saying is, be like the first man. Just as Adam, if he were to bring a sacrifice, would not bring it from something which is stolen, you too don't bring it from something which is stolen. Let's look at another verse when it talks about the bird offering. In the case of the bird offering, it says in verse 16, when you offer the bird offering, ve'hisir et mur'ota benotzota, take out its mur'ah, its stomach, and throw it away from the altar, even though the whole sacrifice is burnt. But this one part, take it away. Don't let it be burned on the altar. What's the explanation which is given in the Midrash? Because birds, how do they eat? They go all over and eat. They're not particular about eating from their own property. They just go into anybody's property and eat from it. That part, the stomach of the bird, which has food which it has stolen, cannot be brought on the altar. And the last thing which I want to mention is that the end of the Parsha, the very last sacrifice at the end of chapter 5, is what's known as Asham Gizelot, a guilt offering that's brought for theft. It's not just theft or stealing. I shouldn't say theft. It's really stealing. It's where I've stolen and then I swore that I didn't steal and then subsequently admit my guilt. You have to bring a sacrifice to atone for that. But by ending, talking about a sacrifice that's brought for stealing, from beginning to end, what the Torah wants to emphasize in our Parsha is that service of God, clinging to God, cannot be at the expense, cannot be a substitute for our relations with people. And what is perhaps the most fundamental relationship which we have with people, which is respecting their property, respecting their person. So that what I tried to show you is, in certain details of the laws of sacrifices, we can see the underlying ethical principles of how stealing is something which is totally unacceptable. In today's reality, we very often hear about this division between relations with God, rituals, and ethics. And unfortunately, we have too many examples of religious people, so to speak, who are unethical. If they had really learned our Parsha the way they should learn it, there would be absolutely no question that it's inconceivable to do a ritual, to have a relationship with God, and not be ethical. To be ethical is the ground level. It's the basis of everything. Our relationship with God should then take it to another level. So I would like to end by saying to everyone, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to actually have a conversation with you. And as I'm looking at the certain comments, it's nice to see the people who have been here. And I'm glad to be able to have had this contact. And maybe we can find a better way of somehow making this more interactive. But at the same time, I hope that I've given you a sense of why the book of Vayikra is so important and why studying the sacrifices is so important and why it's important to realize that there has to be a way found to integrate our relationship with God with our relationship with people, to have our relationship with God, which is coming from a place of love and not a place of fear, and where it will not be just one or a few people who are doing this, but when in fact we do it on a mass level, At that point, we will be able to actualize our mission, which is to be Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. And at that point, we can actually say that our world is a place where God feels very welcome to occupy. Maybe I shouldn't use the word occupy, because that's loaded. It's a very welcome place for God to dwell and feel comfortable. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Chodesh Tov. And in today's reality of Corona, I just want to mention, we are in the month of Nisan, the month of the redemption from Egypt, the month where the salvation of God came in a twinkle. In the same way that the coronavirus came so quickly and unexpectedly, let us hope that it will also depart from us so that we can go out of being quarantined in our homes and be able to experience, the wide open spaces. But I would say to also take what we've learned from this experience and all the positive things that have come out, and to continue them in our normal lives. Shabbat Shalom.